We are back with a brand new episode, and we're going to talk about common puffins, also known as Atlantic puffins. We had a listener ask to do a puffin episode, and so we're actually going to do two different episodes, one on common puffins and one on tufted puffins. It turns out that John and Shannon each prefer one over the other, so it's a lot of fun hearing each of them plead their case for which is the best puffin. Covering the common puffin today, we talk about the conservation efforts which have been made to bring their population back in Maine, how climate change has affected their diet, and the amazing color patterns on their bill and face. Marky joins us this week as well. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. We're back for a new episode to talk about the common puffin. This is RJ, and I'm with Amanda and John and Shannon, and we have Marky back with us as well to talk about the puffin. So we had a listener, I think his name was Carl, who wrote in and asked us to do a puffin episode. And so we were talking, and I brought it up, and John and Shannon were like, "Well, which puffin, the tufted or the common?" So we're gonna do both. So this first episode we'll talk about the common. But yeah, any thoughts to kick it off on the common puffin? The Atlantic puffin?
Who's the fan of the common puffin? Is it John or Shannon?
It's me. I'm absolutely a big fan of common puffins, or Atlantic puffins as they're often called. And so,
or usually called.
Yeah. So this is people love these birds, and what they are is they're kind of, I mean, they look like clowns. They have these big bills and these black and white plumages and neat facial patterns, and they're bright orange feet that are webbed, and so they can't move on land very well at all. They kind of have these landing areas where they come in and crash on the islands that they nest on, and so they're just spectacular seabirds. I mean, I think one of the most important things to emphasize to people is they're not penguins. They're not closely related to penguins. Penguins are a southern hemisphere radiation of birds that are aquatic and fly in the water, and we should talk about penguins at some point because they're pretty darn cool. But puffins are part of this group called the alcids, and it's a whole bunch of species of birds that are related to gulls and terns that nest on cliff faces all along the coasts of both the Pacific and the Atlantic sides of North America. And common puffins are the better version of tufted puffin and horned puffin on the Atlantic side.
Yeah, John and I have mutually exclusive views of puffins. My West Coast bias will show through. I think tufted puffins are much cuter. But anyways, they're all hilarious and looking, at least. And they're very long-lived birds for something that seems kind of small. I think the oldest one of the Atlantic puffin was over 30 or 31 years old. So that's pretty old, which is an important thing to keep in mind when you talk about their nesting biology, because often they're not breeding until they're between 3 and 6 years old, and they're spending that time out in the open ocean, which is really interesting too. They're not on land, but they're not adapted to gliding or anything of the sort. So when you watch them fly, they have to work super, super hard to go anywhere. And that even is shown in their muscles. They have a lot of red blood cells and things like that in their muscles because they have to work so hard, and their breast muscles are pretty substantial because of that. But when you look at them flying, you're like, how on earth does that bird get out into the middle of the ocean? But they're adapted to flying underwater, so a little bit similar to penguins again in kind of how they make a living. But their wings are nowhere near like penguins. Penguins have their wings have everything's fused and they're like flippers underwater, but that's not true of puffin wings. But they do very nicely swim underwater, and there are really cool videos of them underwater. These birds are not uncommon in some zoos, so you can get a look at them close up, because you you won't believe their faces when you see them. You think someone had to have made that up as a Halloween costume, and because they have facial skin that's colored in certain times of the year, and so in the breeding season, the Atlantic one has these plates on its beak that is shaped really thinly like a knife, and the plates are really brightly colored. And they lose those things when they're not in the breeding season. So by the time they go back out into the ocean to, spend the rest of their time finding food in the water in the open ocean, they don't look like that. They're much paler versions of themselves, but they really know how to dress themselves up for the breeding season. Including, if you look at pictures, and you can see it in the specimens themselves, they have these, well, you can't see the bright colors of the mouth linings, but they have those too. But they have these like little, I don't know, waddly like things. I don't know what their really official name is, in the gape of their mouth. And those are different in the different species. The tufted puffin ones looks different from the Atlantic puffin ones, but they have these little things. When they open their mouth, you're like, holy cow. It's not just their...
And is it like skin, or what?
It is.
I saw
like
that as well in the
wrinkly
pictures.
skin?
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it is. And it's colored too.
So
And then do they store fish there? I saw a thing about how they can carry like a lot of different fish in their beak, and they have a way of fitting them in there. And do they store them in that kind of skin part in the corner of their beak as well, or?
So it's really interesting because the nesting biology of these birds is they nest in these colonies with these where they have fairly small little holes that they lay one egg in, and those photos that there are classic photos online of Atlantic puffins with up to 10 fish in the bill. That's almost all situations where they're bringing fish into the young. And so they've got a special setup the way their bill's designed to allow them to do that. And so that's how they provision their young. And the data that I was looking at blew me away in terms of how much, like 65% of the chicks in colonies most years actually fledge, which is really good. And the only caveat is that this is a bird that's really tied to an ecosystem that's highly affected by humans and by climate change. And so particularly in places like Maine, where people spend every year, it's a big tourist attraction in Maine to go out to the islands and see these colonies of puffins and also northern gannets that exist there. But what's starting to happen is, because of climate change and warming oceans, some of the fish populations that they depend on, which are those beautiful pictures of them with these little fish, are actually moving down in the water column to where the puffins can't reach them, or further out to sea. And that's resulted in some situations where there have been major nest failures over the past couple of years at some of the colonies in Maine in particular. They go up into Newfoundland and Labrador too. And what they think is going on is that the birds aren't able to get at the right sized fish. And sometimes when you say store fish, I'm wondering if what you're talking about is a situation they've noticed where one of the fish, it's called
is it the butterfish?
Butterfish, exactly. Yeah. So butterfish, they're catching, and butterfish are a species that's moving in now that some of these smaller fish have actually moved out. And the adults can catch them fine, and the adults can eat them, but they bring them back and try to give them to the chicks, and they're too big for the chicks to swallow. And so they just sit in the nest, and then the chicks, if that keeps happening, the chicks will starve to death, even though there's fish for them.
So there's a recovery program, and when you look at Audubon Society's website about this, it was started as the Puffin Project, and it's now a Seabird, the Seabird Project, and what's it called? Audubon Seabird Institute. So that's what it's kind of changed into now, is they've revised and upgraded their goals, and they started because to reintroduce them into Maine, so to make artificial nests, and then they translocated birds, and they started this in the 70s, translocating birds from one population into this place where there used to be puffins, but there weren't any more. And they made artificial nests and then brought babies over, because these birds will go back to where they're born to breed. And so if you can convince them that this is the right place, they'll go back. And it took them a few years, but the birds have started going back. So they're getting a population of these things now, which is really interesting. But it's a huge tourist attraction. So you can see why Maine wants these two populations that they have of introduced birds. They want them because even if you look at, there's a gift store for the puffin thing, and there's a lot of things and a lot of really cute things in the puffin store. And it, the tourist part of this is really important. They're going beyond that, but because they have to fundraise somehow to get these projects going. But they're dedicated a lot to training people, to monitoring, to getting rid of predators in these islands, which is a big deal. If cats get into some of these islands, that's the end of it. So, and it's working. It is working. It's a good interplay of conservation and tourism. And they are adorable birds, like seriously, absolutely adorable. And if you see them try to land, they are funny as anything too, because there's nothing graceful. In fact, they nest up high because they can't get off the ground if they don't have kind of the ability to jump off of a cliff, because they can't glide. So it's really hard for them to run too much and then get in the air. Their wings are just very small and rounded. So yeah, everything about them is kind of goofy but adorable.
I was reading about the Project Puffin and about them coming back after that first time that they fledged, and they were talking about just how decoys played like a major role, and how that was kind of a big turning point, was that they hadn't come back after a couple of years, which I think was common with puffins anyway. They spend 2 or 3 years out at sea before they first return. But they started to build like decoys or fake puffins out there. And once those were out there was really when they felt comfortable and started coming back, which I thought was super interesting. And I think that they were saying that that was kind of a major turning point in general, that that term like social attraction with birds kind of comes back to that. That was like a major breakthrough in that.
That's definitely something with colonial seabirds, is that they'll respond to seeing models of others to come in. But one of the neat things about these guys is they have very strong homing instincts. And so they had good reason to think that those birds that they brought in and raised in those burrows would actually come back. But, what I was thinking as I was reading about that was how crazy it is to let those chicks fledge and then know that you're going to have to wait 3 years before they even start coming back. It's a lot of investment to keep your fingers crossed. And
Yeah.
So are they literally like at sea that entire time before they come back to mate?
Yeah,
and
apparently.
this is a really, and almost nothing is known about even. I mean, they're not even seen that much because it's this is the North Atlantic, and it's not a heavily trafficked area, so there's not much known about the non-breeding season or what these young are doing as they're out at sea on their own.
I didn't look. Is Project Puffin putting trackers on them? Because that's another thing, just like limpkins, right? They're out of your sight, and they're spending most of their life out of your sight as a human observer, and we don't get much insight into where they go, how much time they spend moving, how much time they spend sitting on the water, how much time they spend under the water.
I've got a suspicion that putting trackers on birds that are diving and flying around like that. No, I don't know.
It's not practical.
It could be wrong. Well, not yet. It will be. Somebody will figure it out.
There's a thing going around right now, or at least recently, where they have these cameras on shearwaters. You can actually watch them dive underwater, sort of like their perspective. So I know that it's possible to put things on seabirds that go underwater.
Oh wow.
Well, that's super cool.
I think I saw. I think I
Yeah.
saw one of those videos. It was
No,
was
it's a
it on a
shearwater.
penguin? Did you say?
I think there are things on penguins too, but I think
Oh,
they
okay.
recently did this with shearwaters.
Okay.
And then also they've also found a way to put trackers
very
on
cool.
hummingbirds. So the technology is there to figure out to work with incredibly small birds, incredibly big birds, and birds underwater.
Wow.
So go Canada, because the Atlantic puffin is a provincial bird of Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's a pretty cool bird. Sorry, no offense, cardinal and other things, but you've been.
We were laughing when we were reading about how the chicks were taken from Newfoundland and brought to Maine for part of the Puffin project. Amanda was like, "Oh, they're telling them like, okay, you're American now."
Yes. Yeah, we watched a lot of videos about the Atlantic puffin, and another cute thing I was thinking when you guys were talking about how cute they are and how they're like clowns. The videos we watched, they talked about how when they're in the breeding colony, that it's so crowded that they have like different walks, like mean different things, and they have this walk where they'll like put their head down and just like really kind of keep themselves small to walk through like another bird's territory. And it's like the commentators in the video were like, this is the I'm minding my own business walk. it was so cute.
It kind of looked like the sad Charlie Brown walk, like
Yes.
head down, kind of hands in the pocket. But I think there was one of the videos we saw. There was like a group of researchers, and the puffin just like walked right between all them. But he totally changed his like demeanor and went into that walk that Amanda's talking about to pass through all them. And then the second he was out of their way, kind of walk normal again.
So
Yes.
it's like when
It
you
was
get on
really-
a crowded subway and you kind of turn into yourself, right?
Yes.
So that
Exactly.
you're not
Yes.
paying attention to everybody that might be looking at you. Or life as a graduate student when everybody's judging you all the time. But, yes, that must be a really weird thing, right? The idea that you need your own space, this place is crowded. How do you not lose your mind?
So the other thing in those situations I wonder about is they must have some really neat spatial visualization memory skills, because if they talk about them flying right back to the burrow that they're nesting in, and all I can think is, if you don't end up in your burrow and you've got to walk around a little bit, all the birds look the same, the landscape looks pretty much the same. It's amazing to me that you can end up figuring your way back to your own burrow at that point. So I wonder how much individual recognition of neighbors and things like that there is. You'd think there has to be some, but I don't know what level of cognition it is.
Someday artificial intelligence will tell us that. It might be hard for people to do that, but all of the factors that might make individuals unique, certain spots or just slightly asymmetric feathers or
smells.
whatever, that could identify individuals.
Yeah, smell is that's a really
Yeah.
which is interesting, because the adults tend to forage less on fish and more on crustaceans out in the open ocean, I think. And I wonder whether some of that can be helped by smell at some level too.
Yeah, I know certain species of alcids have a very strong smell. So maybe each bird has its own slightly different smell or something.
Ooh, that makes them like little mammals.
I think I forget which auklet it is, but they smell like tangerines apparently.
Oh, that's cool.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Can we talk about their call a little bit? Do they sound like little chainsaws?
Yes.
Maybe that's not their call, but I know they make a noise that sounds like that. We were listening to a lot of videos, and it was like, it literally sounds like someone revving up a chainsaw, like
Yes.
a rrrr.
And all I ever think about when I hear that is how much information does that convey? Because
Right.
it's a bizarre sound, and yet at the same time, it doesn't seem to vary all that much across. It's really interesting to think about how communication works in birds like this.
I mean, one of the first conservation genomic studies in birds, a seabird, I think this might be the first one, was done on Atlantic puffins. In the couple years ago, it was published, like whole genomes comparing 70 individuals to each other, looking at whether there's population structuring, whether our population's different, and if they are different, where do they come together? And it turns out the things they found genomically suggest that the way subspecies, I'll put that in quotes, these are air quotes for anybody who's listening because I don't believe in subspecies, but they don't track the genomic variation. And there are contact zones between these differentiated populations, places that, were unknown before this study came out. So that there's just a lot to know if you want to conserve these populations. If you're going to translocate things, you ought to know the genetic structure of these populations before you take one thing and put it somewhere else. If you do that, you have to do it knowingly, because that could have huge consequences for your ability to conserve. Not to mention, I always think about, well, what happens when someone comes back at 10,000 years from now and starts studying these things, because the population structure could look completely different, not because it's natural, but because humans move them around.
So one of the things along those lines that I found really interesting is there is that the genetic structure corresponded to size variation too. And that implies that there's actually some plasticity in morphology, such that this whole issue about whether or not they can eat various sized fish may give them some flexibility. And there's some indication that there's been some morphological change in some of the colonies that the researchers are attributing to, again, the ability to respond to changing fish populations, which is unfortunately something that they're almost certainly going to deal with in the coming centuries.
What is their status like overall? So we've talked about the Project Puffin to help bring the population back in Maine, but I know overall that they're spread out a lot more than that and go all the way, to Europe even. But with these changes to fish and global warming and everything, are they taking a step in the wrong direction? And I mean, is it at a point where it's like sound the alarm yet, or?
So I think because they're puffins and they're so iconic to a lot of people, the alarm has been sounded and they've been put on endangered species lists in places like the UK, United Kingdom. But at the same time, what I think is, looking at it, it's a beautiful example of the capacity to monitor birds pretty well in these situations, so they know how well they're doing from year to year. And when you have those kinds of data, a lot of times what you end up seeing is there are peaks and valleys that are just kind of natural fluctuations of the populations. And what you end up having to do is just get the long-term data to understand over decades how those peaks and valleys might be indicating what directions the populations are going. So I think some of the populations in places like Iceland appear to be very strong and holding steady. And
except the genomics paper outlined the fact that of 9 of the last 13 years, they had complete fledgling failure in the largest population. So if that happens, it doesn't take very long for there to be a really critical loss of individuals, and something that has some pretty substantial population sizes. They can fluctuate dramatically, and genomics can tell you things about that too. So you can use genomes and you can look at the variation in genomes and get some insight into the past population fluctuations that have happened. So there's a lot of good things that can come out of the kinds of studies that we do in museums too.
Yeah, absolutely true.
I was just going to say, that
Marky.
totally ties into where you mentioned their longevity. It'll take a while for us to see some of those effects if they're commonly living 20, 30 years. So acting now is important for sure.
Well, and with a long-lived seabird like this, the other thing is that it's possible that you could fail for a year or two, and then the next 5 to 6 years are great. And so it just highlights how really valuable the ability to monitor what's going on at these different colonies is.
Well, I think we're getting close on time on this one. Is there anything we want to talk about for the Atlantic puffin before we get into our tufted puffin episode?
Oh, I think the victory's assured. Atlantic puffins rule.
Nice
I
try.
like your confidence, John.
Wrong.
We'll find out. Tune in next week to
Yeah.
find out the conclusion. Okay, that was our common puffin episode. Join us next week to talk about the tufted puffins, Shannon's favorite puffin. If you have a question for us that you'd like read and answered on the podcast, send it to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe or follow in your podcast app so you always get our newest episodes sent your way. Thanks to all of our listeners. We love you all. We appreciate the support and can't thank you enough. Okay, see you all next week.